On New Year's Day, my dad handed out gifts to everyone in the room, everyone except me. I stood there with a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands, watching smiles bloom and fade as boxes were opened, hugs exchanged, laughter carefully timed for photos. My brother admired his new watch. My aunt clutched a scarf like it was proof she mattered. Even distant relatives got envelopes, something small to say you belong here. When my name wasn't called, I told myself it was a mistake. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, I asked. My dad didn't hesitate. He didn't lower his voice. He just looked at me like I was a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. "Why would I spend money on you?" he said. "You're the one who walked away from this family." Then, as if that wasn't enough, he added, "You're only here out of habit. You don't really belong with us anymore." My brother laughed. I smiled. And I walked out, knowing that was the last day I would ever beg to exist in my own family. My name is Stella Parker, and for a long time, I thought coming home meant something. I hadn't planned to be there on New Year's Day. I almost stayed in my apartment, telling myself that distance was healthier, that adulthood meant choosing peace over tradition. But my dad had called 3 times in 1 week, each voicemail ending the same way. "It's New Year's," he said. "Be here, we're still family." So I drove back. The house looked exactly the way it always had, too clean, too staged, like a showroom pretending to be a home. The framed photos along the hallway told a carefully edited story of our lives. Birthdays, graduations, holidays. In most of them, I was either standing slightly to the side or missing altogether. I noticed that this time, I hadn't before. My dad, Richard, barely looked up from his phone when I walked in. "You're late," he said, checking the time as if I'd missed a meeting. "Happy New Year to you too," I replied, forcing a smile. My mom hovered near the kitchen, pretending to be busy. My brother Ethan was sprawled on the couch, scrolling, already half bored with the day. No one hugged me. No one asked about work, or the city I lived in now, or how long it had been since they'd last seen me. I told myself not to read into it. That was my old habit, making excuses for silences that were loud if you listened closely. Lunch passed in fragments of small talk. Dad talked about business. Ethan complained about traffic. I nodded when expected, laughed when it felt required. I was present, technically. But it felt like I was watching the scene through glass, close enough to see everything, too far to touch any of it. When Dad announced we'd do gifts after eating, something in my chest tightened. Not because I wanted anything expensive, not because I cared about presents, but because gifts, in my family, were never just gifts. They were proof that you were still seen, still counted, still worth the effort. As wrapping paper started piling up on the coffee table and names were called out, I tried not to think about what it would mean if mine wasn't. I sat down, folded my hands, and waited. At that moment, I still believed this day could end normally. I was wrong. The gifts were handed out like a performance Dad had rehearsed. He stood near the coffee table, glasses perched on his nose, calling names with a confidence that filled the room. Each person stepped forward, accepted their box or envelope, said thank you, and retreated with a smile. It was efficient, controlled, familiar. "Aunt Linda!" "A scarf," she gasped, dramatic and pleased. "Ethan." "A sleek watch." My brother grinned and immediately checked the brand, tilting his wrist so everyone could see. "Cousin Mark." "An envelope." He nodded, grateful enough not to ask questions. I sat on the edge of the couch, my back straight, hands folded in my lap like I was waiting for my turn to speak in class. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Dad was methodical. He liked order. Maybe he was saving mine for last. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. My smile started to ache, frozen in place while the room buzzed around me. Conversations overlapped. Wrapping paper tore. Someone poured more wine. No one looked in my direction. That was when the realization crept in slow and sickening. They weren't forgetting me. They were skipping me. I glanced at my mom. She avoided my eyes. I looked at Ethan, hoping for even a flicker of discomfort. He was too busy admiring himself in his phone camera. The room began to feel smaller, the air thicker, like I was taking up space I wasn't supposed to occupy. I waited a few more seconds, giving them every possible excuse. Then I cleared my throat. "Hey," I said lightly, hating how small my voice sounded. Did I miss my name? The room went quiet in that unnatural way that only families can manage, like everyone had agreed, without speaking, to pause and watch. Dad turned toward me slowly. His expression wasn't confused. It wasn't apologetic. It was irritated. That was when I knew I had already lost something I hadn't realized I was still fighting for. Dad didn't raise his voice. He didn't sigh. He didn't even look angry. That was the worst part. "Why would I spend money on you?" he said, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child who just didn't get it. "You're the one who walked away from this family." The words landed heavy, but he wasn't done. "You made your choices," he continued, straightening the stack of empty gift boxes on the table. "You left. You do your own thing now, so don't sit here expecting to be treated the same." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My ears rang, like the room had shifted slightly off balance. "I didn't walk away," I said finally. "I moved for work, you knew that." Dad gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's what you tell yourself." He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms, settling into the role like he'd been waiting for this moment. "You're only here out of habit, Stella," he said. "You don't really belong with us anymore." My mom stared at the floor. No one corrected him. Ethan snorted from the couch. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "Guess now you finally get it." I turned toward him, my chest tight. "Get what?" I asked. "That you're not on our level anymore," he said, smirking. "You left the family business. You left us. This is just the result." Something inside me cracked, not loudly, not in a way anyone else could hear. It was quieter than that, like a thread snapping after being pulled too tight for too long. I looked around the room one last time. The photos, the gifts, the people who shared my last name and nothing else. I felt small. Then, strangely, I felt clear. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask them to take it back. I smiled. Not because I was okay, but because I was done. I picked up my coat, walked past the coffee table littered with proof that I didn't matter, and headed for the door. No one stopped me. No one followed. As I stepped outside into the cold January air, I realized something that scared me and set me free at the same time. They thought this was the end of the story. For me, it was the beginning. The drive back to my apartment felt longer than it should have. The streets were quiet, still heavy with that strange New Year's emptiness, like the world was holding its breath. I kept replaying my dad's words in my head, each sentence looping back on itself, sharp and deliberate. "You walked away. You don't belong. You're not on our level." That night, alone in my apartment, I finally let myself sit with the truth I had been avoiding for years. I hadn't walked away from my family. I had walked toward survival. When I was 22, the family business Parker Home Solutions was already cracking under the surface. On the outside, it looked successful. Big jobs, confident clients, cash always moving. My dad loved that part. He loved shaking hands, telling stories, being the man everyone trusted. What he hated were questions. I was the one who asked them. I noticed invoices that didn't line up. Jobs marked as paid that never appeared in the bank records. Expenses that were explained away with a shrug and a joke about how construction was messy business. "Don't worry about it," Dad used to say. "Numbers don't tell the whole story." But I knew they told a story, and it wasn't a good one. So I left. Not in anger. Not dramatically. I moved to Chicago, took a job in accounting and compliance, and built a life that made sense to me. I told myself distance would cool things down, that once I proved I was successful on my own terms, they'd respect me. Instead, my leaving became the story they told about me. She thinks she's better than us. She chose strangers over family. She abandoned what mattered. By the time I came back for holidays, I was no longer a daughter in their eyes. I was evidence of betrayal. What they never said out loud but made very clear was this: as long as I stayed useful, I was tolerated. The moment I stopped fitting their version of loyalty, I became optional. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something unsettling. The way they treated me on New Year's Day wasn't sudden. It was just the first time they didn't bother hiding it anymore. And somewhere beneath the hurt, another thought surfaced, quiet but impossible to ignore. They still trusted me with something important. Something they assumed I would never question. They were wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Sometime after midnight, I got out of bed and opened my laptop, more out of habit than intention. The glow of the screen filled my apartment, familiar and steady in a way my family never was. 2 years earlier, my dad had asked me for a favor. Just help us organize things a bit, he'd said. You're good with numbers, make something simple. I had built a basic internal system for Parker Home Solutions, nothing fancy, just a way to log jobs, track payments, and compare deposits against invoices. Dad had been proud of it, bragging to clients that his daughter worked in finance. At the time, it felt like a small bridge back into the family. That night, I logged in for the first time in months. At first, everything looked normal. Familiar job names, usual amounts. Then I started scrolling slowly, carefully letting my professional instincts take over. Something didn't sit right. A renovation paid in full, but only part of the money deposited. Another job marked cash received, with no matching bank record. Then another, and another. I filtered by date, by location, by payment type. The same pattern repeated, quietly and consistently. This wasn't sloppiness. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional. My chest tightened as I realized what I was looking at. Cash jobs were being recorded just enough to look legitimate, just enough to keep clients satisfied while the rest disappeared before it ever reached the bank, and then I saw it. My name. Still listed on compliance documents. Still attached to filings that assumed accuracy. Still legally connected to decisions I hadn't made. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, my hands cold despite the heater humming beside me. On New Year's Day, they'd made it clear I didn't belong in their living room. But here inside the system they trusted me to build, I was still very much involved. They had erased me as a daughter, but they were perfectly comfortable using me as a shield. In that moment, the hurt from earlier didn't disappear, but it shifted. It hardened into something else, something steadier, something dangerous in its clarity. I understood then why Dad had been so confident when he spoke to me. He believed I would stay quiet. He believed that no matter how invisible they made me feel, I would protect them simply because we shared a last name. I closed my laptop slowly, not because I was done, but because I knew exactly what I needed to do next. By the time the sun came up on January 2nd, my decision was already made. I hadn't reached it in a burst of anger. There was no dramatic breakdown, no moment where I slammed my laptop shut and swore revenge. What I felt instead was cold, steady clarity, the kind that settles in when denial finally runs out. If I stayed quiet, I wasn't just protecting my family. I was protecting myself from consequences they would never take responsibility for. I spent the morning working with a focus that surprised even me. I exported the data carefully, every job, every payment type, every discrepancy. I created summaries that showed patterns over time, clean, factual, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. I printed the reports, highlighted the gaps, and labeled everything clearly. No opinions. No accusations. Just numbers telling the truth. I copied the full dataset onto a USB drive, then added a stripped-down viewer so anyone could open it without special access. When I was done, I placed the drive and the reports into a plain cardboard box. On top, I placed a single note. Please review. That was it. No signature. No explanation. No emotional appeal. At 8:15 a.m., a courier picked it up from my building. At 8:47, it was delivered to my parents' front porch. I wasn't there to see their faces when the doorbell rang, but I could imagine it perfectly. My dad, still convinced this was all a misunderstanding. My mom, already anxious, sensing something was wrong. Ethan, annoyed, assuming it was another problem someone else would fix. By 9:02, my phone started buzzing. Dad's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Then my mom. Then Ethan. Texts followed. What is this? Is this a joke? You've gone too far, Stella. I turned my phone face down and sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched. My heart was pounding, but underneath the fear was something unexpected, relief. For the first time, I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't asking to be understood. I wasn't trying to belong. I had handed them the truth and stepped back. Whatever happened next would no longer be decided in whispered conversations or family pressure. It would be decided by facts, records, and laws that didn't care who shared a last name with whom. They had treated me like I didn't exist. Now, They were forced to reckon with something they could no longer ignore. Ethan showed up at my apartment that afternoon like nothing had really happened. He didn't knock the way strangers do. He knocked the way people do when they believe they still have rights over you. 2 sharp taps, followed by a pause that assumed I'd open the door. I watched him through the peephole for a few seconds longer than necessary. When I finally let him in, he didn't sit down. He paced. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he demanded, running a hand through his hair. Dad's furious. Mom's barely holding it together. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I gave them information. You blindsided them," he snapped. "Over a stupid holiday." That word hit me harder than I expected. Stupid. "So, that's what it was to you?" I asked quietly. "A holiday?" He stopped pacing and looked at me like I was being dramatic. "Come on, Stella. You know how Dad is. You didn't have to escalate it like this." Escalate. As if I had raised my voice, instead of handing over evidence. "They're saying this could destroy the company," he went on. "There could be audits, penalties, legal trouble. You're tearing the family apart." I let out a slow breath. "No," I said. "I didn't tear anything apart. I just stopped holding it together for them." Ethan scoffed. "You always do this. You leave, then come back acting like you're better than us. Like you're above it." "That's not true," I said. "I left so I wouldn't become this." His jaw tightened. "Dad thinks you're trying to punish him." I finally looked him straight in the eye. "I'm protecting myself," he shook his head. "You're selfish." That old word. The one they always used when I refused to absorb the consequences of their choices. "Selfish would have been staying quiet," I said. "Selfish would have been letting my name sit on documents that aren't true." For a moment, he had nothing to say. Then he tried a different angle. "Think about Mom," he said more softly. "She's scared. Think about everything they built. About how bad this looks." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. They weren't asking if I was okay. They were asking me to make it go away. "I did think about them," I said. "For years. I covered. I minimized. I explained things away. And none of that made me a daughter in that living room yesterday." Ethan stared at me, realization flickering across his face, quickly replaced by resentment. "This isn't you," he muttered. "You used to put family first." I met his gaze without flinching. Putting family first is how I ended up invisible. He left not long after that, slamming the door harder than necessary. When the apartment went quiet again, my hands were shaking, but my resolve wasn't, because beneath the guilt, beneath the fear, one truth was solid and undeniable. They didn't want accountability. They wanted silence. And for the first time in my life, I was no longer willing to give it to them. The lawyer didn't hesitate when I asked the question I had been avoiding since New Year's Day. "If I know this is happening," I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest, "and I stay quiet, am I responsible?" She didn't soften her answer. "Yes." One word, clear, final. She explained my options calmly, how to document what I had access to, how to protect myself legally, how to separate my name from decisions I hadn't made. She talked about compliance, liability, and reporting, not in the language of punishment, but in the language of protection. That mattered to me. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance from a disaster that wasn't mine. I submitted everything through the proper legal channels. I didn't add commentary. I didn't tell my story. I let the records speak for themselves. After that, I stopped answering calls. Weeks passed, then months. There were audits, meetings I wasn't invited to, conversations I only heard about through secondhand whispers. The company downsized. Contracts were lost. The family narrative shifted from, "This is a misunderstanding," to, "You didn't have to take it that far." But something strange happened in my own life. The constant anxiety I'd carried for years began to fade. I slept better. I focused at work. I stopped flinching every time my phone buzzed. I wasn't invisible anymore, not to myself. Today, I work in compliance consulting. I help businesses avoid the exact mistakes my family made. I teach people that transparency isn't a threat, it's protection. My dad and brother don't call. My mom sends the occasional message that never quite becomes an apology. And that's okay, because on New Year's Day, when they decided I didn't exist, they unknowingly gave me something I'd never had before: freedom. I walked out of that house smiling not because I had won, but because I was finally done trying to belong where I was only valued when I stayed quiet. Sometimes, choosing yourself doesn't look dramatic. Sometimes, it looks like walking away calmly and letting the truth stand where you used to stand instead.